everybody. Today, Honey is going to continue reading Wayside Book 2. Wayside School is Falling Down, written by Louis Shacker and illustrated by Tim Hodge. Chapter 15. She's back. Dee Dee ran across the playground screaming. At first, Louis thought she was just having fun, but then he realized something was wrong. He hurried after her and grabbed her arm. "Dee Dee, are you all right?" he asked. She stared at him with wide-eyed and as she continued to scream. Several other kids gathered around. "What's wrong with Dee Dee?" asked Myron. "I don't know," said Louis. Dee Dee hiccuped 3 times, then gasped. "I saw her." "Who?" asked Louis. Dee Dee didn't answer. She just stared right through him. But everyone else knew whom Dee Dee had just seen. Most of them had seen her too during the last 2 weeks. "Where was she?" asked Todd. "On the monkey bars," said Dee Dee, still screaming and breathing hard. "I was hanging upside down, and suddenly she was hanging upside down right next to me." "Did she wiggle her ears?" asked Jenny. "Only one," said Dee Dee. "I jumped off and ran away before she could wiggle the other one." "That's good," said Rondi. "Who is she?" asked Louis. "A hippopotamus?" "No," said Myron with a laugh. "Why do you say that?" "Because when a hippopotamus gets mad, it wiggles its ears." "She's worse than a hippopotamus," said Allison. "I saw her last week at the water fountain," said Todd. "I bent down to get a drink, but there she was, drinking at the faucet next to me." "I saw her on the stairs," said Rondi. "I was going up the stairs. She went right past me, sliding down the banister." "Who?" asked Mrs. Jewell, asked Louis. "Mrs. Gorf," said Dee Dee. Just saying the name sent a shiver of fear through her body. "Oh, your old teacher," said Louis with a shrug. "Is she back? I always wondered what happened to her." The children looked at each other. Mrs. Gorf was the teacher they had before Mrs. Jules took over. They had never told anyone how they gotten rid of her. They especially couldn't tell Louis. She was the meanest teacher in the history of Wayside School. Of course, there are other teachers at other schools who were meaner. Louis looked toward the monkey bars. "I don't see her," he said. "Well, she was there," Dee Dee insisted. "I saw her." "You just imagined you saw her, Dee Dee," said Louis. "If you hate somebody or if you love somebody, you often think you see the person when she isn't there. It's very common. It's just like Mrs. Draziel." "Who's Mrs. Draziel?" said Todd. "She's the worst teacher I ever had," said Louis. He shivered just thinking about her. "She was my teacher when I was your age. Sometimes I think I see her too, and I still have nightmares about her." "Was she mean?" asked Rondi. "She was horrible," said Louis. "Every morning she used to check our fingernails. If they were dirty, she would tell the whole class. 'Louis has dirty fingernails this morning,' he'd say in a really nasty voice. If you talked in class, he would pick a waste paper basket and put it over your head. You have to leave it on your head until the bell rang." "Did she ever put it over your head?" asked Todd. "Lots of times," said Louis. Everybody laughed. "It isn't funny," said Louis. "My mother always knew when I would get in trouble because I had bits of trash stuck in my hair." "Did it get stuck on your mustache too?" asked Rondi. "Louis didn't have a mustache when he was our age," said Allison. "Did you, Louis?" she asked. Suddenly, Louis screamed. Everybody stared at him. "She's back," he shouted, and he shook with fear. Then he slapped himself in the face. "Excuse me," he said. "Sorry. For a second I thought Mrs. Jewell ill." He turned to Dee Dee. "Come on, let's go to the monkey bars." "No," declared Dee Dee. "I'm not going back. I'm never getting on the monkey bars again." Liz took hold of her hand. "Mrs. Gorf isn't there," he said. "You just imagined her." They headed to the monkey bars. No one else dared to follow. If she starts to wiggle her ears, run away as fast as you can, warned Didi. She held tightly on Lucy's hand. When they reached the monkey bars, no one was there. Where were you when you saw her? Louis asked. I was hanging upside down over there, said Didi, pointing. Okay, go hang upside down, said Louis. No, exclaimed Didi. Don't worry, it was just right there in the case anything happens. It had rained during the night, so the sand under the monkey bars were wet and some wet hard. Didi walked across the sand and pulled herself up to the bar. She shook the legs over, then hung from her knees. Well, do you see her? Louis asked. No, it's safe now, said Didi. Thanks, Louis. I guess you're right. I must have seen my shadow or something. Didi pulled herself right side up, then hopped down from the monkey bars. She and Louis walked away hand in hand. She held Louis's hand not because she was scared, but because she liked him. Mrs. Drozil sounds almost as bad as Mrs. Gorf, said Didi. She was, said Louis. She once made me put gum on my nose because I was chewing it in class. How can you chew on your nose? Asked Didi. Behind them, Didi's footprints can be seen in the wet under the monkey bars. There was also another set of footprints made by a person who had much bigger feet. Chapter 16, Love and a Dead Rat. Damien was in love with one of the girls in the class. Can you guess which one? He thought about her all the time. Myron threw a rat ball to Damien. It bounced off his face. Huh? Said Damien. Why didn't you catch the ball? Said Myron. What ball? Said Damien. The one that hit you on the face, said Myron. Did a ball hit me on the face? Asked Damien. Yes, said Myron. Oh, good, said Damien. I was wondering why my nose hurt. He had been thinking about the girl he loved. He was in love with Mrs. Jules. That was why he was always doing things for her, like passing out papers. He thought she was very pretty and nice. She thought she was smart too. In fact, he thought she was one of the smartest people in the class. After recess, he hurried back up the stairs. Hello, Damien, said Mrs. Jules. Hello, Mrs. Jules, he said. You're always the first one here, aren't you? Said Mrs. Jules. Damien blushed and shrugged her shoulders. Do you need any papers to pass out or something? He asked. It's so nice of you to ask, said Mrs. Jules. I think you're nice too, said Damien. Mrs. Jules gave him a stack of workbooks to hand out. Then she gave him a Tootsie Roll Pop from the coffee can of her desk for being so helpful. But don't eat it until after lunch, she said. I won't, assured her. He ate lunch with Myron and DJ. He saved the Tootsie Roll Pop for last. Joy and Mauricia came up behind him. Hey, Damien, said Joy. How's your girlfriend? What? Asked Damien. He turned red. Who are you talking about? I don't have a girlfriend. You're in love with Mrs. Jules, accused Mauricia. You better watch out, said Joy. Mr. Jules might come after you. The two girls laughed. I don't know what you're talking about, said Damien. I'm not in love with Mrs. Jules. He looked to his friends for support. Myron shrugged. DJ smiled. Prove it, said Joy. Prove you're not in love with her. That's stupid, said Damien. How can I prove I'm not in love with Mrs. Jules? Give her this, said Joy. She handed Damien a paper bag. Your lunch? asked Damien. Look inside, said Mauricia. Inside the paper bag was a dead rat. Damien knew Mrs. Jules hated dead rats more than anything in the world. Put it under her desk, said Joy. If you don't, it means you love her, said Mauricia. I'm not in love with her, said Damien. Prove it, said Joy. Okay, I will, said Damien. The girls laughed. You don't have to put the dead rat in her desk, said DJ. We don't care, said Myron. You think I'm in love with her, don't you? asked asked Damien. Myron shrugged. DJ smiled. Some friends you are, said Damien. I'll show you. After lunch, he was the first one back in class. He carried Joy's paper sack. Hello, Damien, said Mrs. Jules. Did you have a nice lunch? It was all right, he murmured. Oh, I wouldn't mind getting the construction paper from the closet and putting on my desk, said Mrs. Jules. Thank you. Damien went to the closet and got the construction paper and put it on her desk. Then, when she wasn't looking, he opened her desk drawer and dumped the red into it. He shut the drawer. Thank you, Damien, said Mrs. Jules. You're always so helpful. It's such a pleasure to have you in my class. Damien felt awful. Mrs. Jules read a story to the class. Damien couldn't pay attention. He kept wondering why she'd opened her drawer. After the story, there had earth. Everyone was supposed to make snowflakes. Damien folded his piece of construction paper in half. Mrs. Jules screamed. What's wrong, Mrs. Jules? Asked Joy. Somebody put a dead rat in my desk, said Mrs. Jules. I did, declared Damien. Damien, said Mrs. Jules with a great surprise. Why? Because I hate you, said Damien. You always make me to do things for you. Oh, I see, said Mrs. Jules. Should I write my name on the board under the discipline? He asked. No, that won't be necessary, said Mrs. Jules. That made him feel even worse. Why did I have to prove myself to Joy? He wondered. I don't like Joy. I like Mrs. Jules. He felt rotten. When the bell rang, Damien waited for all other kids to leave. Then he walked to Mrs. Jules' desk. She was grading papers. Yes, Damien? Do you want me to erase the board for you? He asked. That's all right, said Mrs. Jules. I'll do it myself. Damien sadly walked out of the room and down the stairs. Then he reached the bottom. He turned and ran back up to Mrs. Jules's room. She was just putting on her coat. I love you, Mrs. Jules, Damien declared. I'm sorry I put that red on your desk. I did it because I didn't want everyone to know I love you. I'm sorry. I love you too, Damien, said Mrs. Jules. You do? But what about Mr. Jules? Just because I love Mr. Jules, it doesn't mean I can also love you. Love is different from most things. She picked up a piece of chalk. If I gave my piece of chalk to someone, then I would have it anymore. But when I give my love to someone, I end up with more love than I started with. The more love you give away, the more you have left. Damien smiled. I love you, Mrs. Jules, he said. He felt his heart fill with more love. I love you, Damien, said Mrs. Jules. It's getting disgusting, said the dead rat. He climbed out of Mrs. Jules' desk and walked out of the room. Chapter 17. What? It was purple, so Jenny read the story backward. When she finished, she threw up. Okay, said Jenny. So read the story backwards, suggested Mrs. Jules. That way the beginning will be a surprise. But I already know how the story ends, Jenny complained. I only like stories with surprise endings. Good point, said Mrs. Jules. Here, you can read the story yourself. It's very funny. She gave the book to Jenny. All I heard was the last sentence, said Jenny. It wasn't funny unless you know what happened first. Why aren't you laughing, Jenny? Said Mrs. Jules. Didn't you think it was a funny story? That made Dana laugh harder. There goes the Eagle box, said Myron. Everybody laughed except for Jenny. Dana laughed hysterically. Mrs. Jules looked back at the story she had been reading before Jenny's interruption. There was only one sentence left for her to read. She read it to the class. Jenny made a face. She could still taste the awful stuff. Next time you'll drink your prune juice more quickly, said Mrs. Jules. Jenny sat down. Mrs. Jules waited Jenny to sit down. Jenny wrote her name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Well, that's no excuse, said Mrs. Jules. Now go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. I couldn't leave the table until I finished it, explained Jenny. Then I missed the bus. What does prune juice have to do with anything? Asked Mrs. Jules. Because I hate prune juice, Jenny gripped. Why are you late? Asked Mrs. Jules. I can't hear you, said Jenny. I better take off my helmet. She took off her helmet. Take off your helmet, said Mrs. Jules. What? Asked Jenny. Why are you late? said Mrs. Jules. Jenny caught her breath. What? She said. She couldn't hear too well because she was still wearing the motorcycle helmet. Mrs. Jules looked up from the story she had been reading to the class. You're late, she said. She stopped off the bike in front of Wayside School and trudged up the stairs. Her stomach was still going up and down as she opened the door to Mrs. Jules's room. She put on her helmet. Then her father drove her to the school on the back of the motorcycle. It was a very bumpy ride. Put on your helmet, said the father. I'll drive you to school to the back of my motorcycle. I missed the bus, Jenny grumped. Why are you doing home? Asked the mother. She finally got it all done, then hurried as fast as she could to the bus stop. When she got there, the bus was just pulling away. She sighed, then turned around and ran all the way back home. Her mother wouldn't let her leave the breakfast table until she finished the prune juice. It took her forever. She hated prune juice more than anything in the world. One day, Jenny was late for school. I'll read this story backwards, then it will make more sense. One day, Jenny was late for school. Her mother wouldn't let her leave the breakfast table until she finished the prune juice. It took her forever. She hated prune juice more than anything in the world. She finally got it all done, then hurried as fast as she could to the bus stop. When she got there, the bus was just pulling away. She sighed, then turned around and ran all the way back home. What are you doing home? Asked her mother. I missed the bus, Jenny grumped. Put on your helmet, said her father. I'll drive you to school on my back of my motorcycle. She put on her helmet and her father drove her to the school on the back of her motorcycle. It was a very bumpy ride. She hopped off the bike in front of Wayside School and trudged up the stairs. Her stomach was still going up and down as she opened the door to Mrs. Jules's room. Mrs. Jules looked up from the story she had been reading to the class. You're late, she said. Jenny caught her breath. What? She asked. She couldn't hear too well because she was still wearing the motorcycle helmet. Why are you late? Said Mrs. Jules. What? Said Jenny. Take off your helmet, said Mrs. Jules. I can't hear you, said Jenny. I better take on my helmet. She took off her helmet. Why are you late? Said Mrs. Jules. Because I hate prune juice, Jenny gripped. What does prune juice have to do with anything? Asked Mrs. Jules. I couldn't leave the table until I finished it, explained Jenny. Then I missed the bus. Well, that's no excuse, said Mrs. Jules. Now go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Jenny wrote her name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Mrs. Jules waited for Jenny to sit down. Jenny sat down. The next time you'll drink your prune juice more quickly, said Mrs. Jules. Jenny made a face. She could still taste the awful stuff. Mrs. Jules looked back at the story she had been reading before Jenny's interruption. There was only one sentence left for her to read. She read it to the class. Everybody laughed except for Jenny. Dana laughed hysterically. There goes the giggle box, said Myron. That made Dana laugh harder. Why aren't you laughing, Jenny? Asked Mrs. Jules. Didn't you think it was a funny story? All I heard was the last sentence, said Jenny. It isn't funny unless you know what happened first. Good point, said Mrs. Jules. Here, you can read the story yourself. It's very funny. She gave the book to Jenny. But I already know how the story ends, Jenny complained. I only like stories with surprise endings. So read the story backwards, suggested Mrs. Jules. Well, that way the beginning will be a surprise. Okay, said Jenny. So Jenny read the story backward. Then when she finished, she threw up. It was purple.